Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller and the event director at Literati bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Wallis Wilde-Menozzi in support of Silence and Silences. Just a quick webinar overview for those of you who are joining us live. The chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window open. I'll be sharing links to purchase Silence and Silences from Literati throughout the event. In fact, I will do so starting right now. Live transcription is also available to you on your toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books in the description directly below me. And you can be sure to also subscribe to our channel as well. That way you can stay up to date on all of our virtual events when they become available at a later date as recordings on the channel. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan or in the Ann Arbor area, of course, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. So most of all, we'd just like to thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon or much later this evening, depending on when and where in the world you may be joining us from. So without further ado, I'll introduce our author this evening. Wallis Wilde-Menozzi is the author of Mother Tongue, The Other Side of the Tiber, and Tuscalini's Ray. Her poetry, essays, and translations have appeared at Granta, Best Spiritual Writings, Words Without Borders, and Tel Aviv Review. A collection of her essays was published in Italian. She lives in Parma, Italy, where she'll be returning to in a week's time, but is joining us now from Bronxville, which is sort of a bit appropriate given the both locations featured prominently in Silence and Silences. So please join me in a virtual welcome of Wallis Wilde-Menozzi. Wallis, I believe we thought we'd get started perhaps with a bit of a reading from the book itself, and feel free to provide any additional context to that reading that you might like to before you and I chat a bit.
Thanks, and thanks for having me, and thanks for the introduction. I wish I were in Ann Arbor. A long time ago, I graduated from the university, and I'm sure it's changed immensely. I'll read the first couple of paragraphs of the book as it opens. It's set in Yonkers because the book has a terrific amount of movement in it, not just between Italy and the United States, other places as well, but there's definitely many back and forth movements between Parma, between Italy, and between Yonkers. The Bronx River in Yonkers is a silt brown color that rarely reflects the sky. The changes in its industrial tone appear when the surface is glassy or when currents capture the surroundings, or when it is striped by lights falling from the hospital windows toward evening and dragged into waving orange ribbons. Today it is still with pewter collars of ice along the edges. The man-made waterfall near the bike bridge is foaming with pollutants, gluey white that attenuate as they bubble and break up downstream. It is dusk, but the sun is not visible. The few runners are mimetically absorbed in the gray ending to this January. Runners checking their watches and wearing black gauges on their ankles. I see robots in woolen hats. The fixed eyes of the joggers get on my nerves. We have become an anxious people, measuring ourselves. I'm here because I wanted to get out of our steam-heated apartment, to feel the wind, and I admit, to look out of the corner of my eye for the white heron I saw late last summer on the day before I returned to Italy, where our house and our work patiently wait.
Thank you. I'm struck by hearing you read and returning myself in a way to the opening of the book by uh, key lines perhaps that I missed or take on new complexion as you read them again, particularly this notion of us as anxious people, as mediated by our devices, which comes up a lot in the text, and as measuring ourselves, because it seems to me that one of the key ideas of the book, and it's going to be, I think, tough for me to express so much of what I find fascinating about this book, because it is ineffable and it's about approaching the ineffable. But that sort of sense of us measuring ourselves is contrasted to a book about mapping out unmeasurable places, right? Which is sort of, in essence, what any kind of silence is. I find it difficult for myself to sort of sum up all of the fascinating things the book is doing within this idea of silence and silences within your approach to nonfiction. But maybe I'll start by asking you a very simple, straightforward, sort of like bookseller or like author interview question, which is sort of, what was the genesis of the book as a project itself, especially this idea that sort of titles it and runs through it. I'm curious if these were fragments that sort of seem to lend themselves to coming together this way, much in the way that a collection of poetry might, or whether there was the idea of the book and you wrote into it a bit from its sort of like an ordinating principle of, I'm going to chart out this idea.
I think basically it was the latter. I was after I'd finished quite a few things, I think I'd gotten to a stage where I was asking myself, does anything that I know need to be written? Does the world need another book? Do I have anything to say? And basically, I've always been so deeply attracted to silence and to stillness and to non-words that I think my answer in some ways was no. But it just came up in a very funny way, and what happened was, when I was asked by my publisher, did I have any book in mind, I said, slightly with a sense of irony, I think, yes, I'm thinking about silence. And of course, to me, that means no words. And he said, well, that sounds very interesting. Why don't you just send me a couple of pages of what you have in mind? And so I did. Really what I did was I sent him what are the first 3 pages of the book. And by the time, and I was in New York when I did that, and at the airport, because now we have these cell phones and all this stuff, a little ping, and he said, you have a contract. And so it was an incredible gift in terms of freeing. I have written, all my books are kind of unusual, or as my editor calls them, highly original, and they're not so obvious. I've been kind of finding my way. So to have this book already, in some sense, accepted, or at least I was given this really free space, just saying, I believe in you. I know you'll, if that's what your subject is, I know you'll find a way to make it come alive, or you'll define it however you want, and that'll be fine. That was an enormous kind of freeing sense that I'd figure it out. So I started writing, as I always do. I was in Italy, and my idea in all 4 of my books has always been, what is the scale for each of our voices? In a sense, particularly American writing, it's often me, and it's me in big letters, and my story and it's my way, my success. And I've always had this sense that I could tell, and it's probably the Midwest, it was the way we were raised, but there was my story. My story was interesting, but so was everyone else's. And certainly in nonfiction, for a long time, I would say European writers that I know fairly well who write French and Italian writers who write in this form, often there's themselves, but there's always a sense of the other also has a say at some point. We don't just tell it from our side, we tell it, or at least give space to realize that this same event is, or these same things are being processed differently and felt differently by others who we may even be telling stories about. And so the fact that I wanted space, I'm so excited by the fact that you felt you were in my idea with this book was to have a dialogue in the way that you might, even in an art gallery, go in, see some pictures, respond to certain ones of them, and then sit down and think about it, or maybe think about your own story, or come back and put two connections together that you hadn't seen before. And so that was my idea. That was the idea of the form. And again, I was given full support. I was never told, oh no, that I just went that way and kept adding stories and moving them around and throwing some out, and finding a narrative that wasn't a narrative, but finding a flow that made connections and kept the reader kind of going.
Yeah, and I'll add to that for our viewers to say that the way the book is sort of constructed is, for lack of a better word, there are these fragments, and they're separated by these spaces, which you mentioned in your office note, that are meant to give space for silence, for readerly silence, for pause. And these fragments are memoir, but not memoir alone. There is literary criticism, essay. There's meditations on women writers who perhaps form your forebears in this form or in the topics you examine. There is anthropology, there is science, all of which is in different ways approaching the idea of silence, or silence is always present. I found it fascinating too how silence takes on different complexions of sort of good or bad kinds of silence. There's certainly lots of silences that are remarked upon that conceal truth, that withdraw from what is right or what is good. And at the same time, there are silences that open up, that are sort of revelatory silences as well, that are examined. So there are sort of stratas of silence that are being explored in a way, and that forms this kind of there's a kind of a central narrative that I might want to ask you about too, about your time in the Department of Child Welfare in New York City, that seems to sort of serve as a kind of important. It's sort of the literal center of the book, but it also seems to form an important crux in what the book is doing. But that's the way I would describe it. I have a penchant at the bookstore for being known to recommend books that I have trouble describing to people, or that are sort of like unwieldy, which I don't really want to say about this, because I feel like Silence and Silence is an incredibly approachable book, much like a collection of poetry would be, where, as you say, there are things that maybe people will respond to, maybe they won't, but together they form this opportunity to interact, much like you would if you walked into a gallery. And I was struck early on reading it, thinking, oh, this reminds me of Sebald, that reminds me of Anne Carson, who you later mentioned as forming this kind of new nonfiction narrative. Anyways, that's just me again responding to this. But
Great. It's somebody who can respond.
but I want to read. Going back to something you mentioned about, the irony of saying I want to write a book about silence, and thinking about now knowing how the book came about. I have another sort of craft compositional question for you that starts with a fragment from early on in the book, or a quote from early on in the book. You write, "Every form of art gives space to silence. Painting describes it. Music uses it for what precedes the first note and follows the last. Notes mark what would otherwise be silence. It is the primary material required for concentration. Silences hold the most obvious places to look for hypotheses in science. Silence echoes everywhere on the longest, most worn path to God." And the thing that I kept thinking about was, how do you write? Thinking about Wittgenstein, right? Like, whereof one cannot speak, one must remain silent, as casting the ladder away from problems that no one can approach. And yet, in writing a book about silence, you have to write about it. But I was struck by how one's readerly experience is silence. One might read in silence. You don't quite read aloud. And one writes in that same way too, where there's the sort of inchoate language in your brain, but you're still sort of huddled in this silence. So I'm curious about, how much in your process, your writing craft was inflected by this idea that there is still something about the writing process or the reading process, when you're writing about silence, that you're sort of breaking that seal in a way, if that makes sense, to get at it.
So I think you're absolutely right, and I thought about Wittgenstein quite a bit at different points. I think silence, though, I wanted to basically have silence be the effect, in a way, of after you'd read the book, or after you'd gone through it or stopped and started. It would make you hear your own kind of silences and actually hear what happens when you stop, when you bump into something that just shows you a slightly different angle and suddenly you're somewhere else. I wanted to create the effect of unknowing, in a way. And I had to do that using words, but I can say that, so much, and I have to say, for me, at the moment, at least, the difference between a literary difference between Italy and America is still, we've become more and more driven by kind of simple ideas or single ideas or some kind of, and of course, let's not even go to consider ideology and what that's doing to reality by just simplifying and crushing things and using words in a certain kind of a way. And so writing this, I was very much aware, because of course I edited it. I mean, I wrote really probably easily a half as much, again, in terms of panels, in terms of these stories, in terms of, and when COVID came in, I had to really toss out a lot of panels that, in a way, the book had been finished, but then in came a new silence before we were. So I had to toss out other things, but the idea was always this fluid sense of leading you to a sense that you can never know enough, that you don't know much, that, everything is kind of a discovery. I wanted to create that sense very much. And I think when I was in Michigan, my honors thesis was on William Wordsworth's The Prelude, which was, of course, that long recounting, and in a way it was very radical at the time, recounting of a life, a personal life, telling it in a rather linear way, but bringing in, other features as well. I wanted to not have stream of consciousness or anything like that, but I wanted to give this sense that none of us can recount our life. None of us can tell. We can tell some stories about it, but to put it all together is virtually impossible. And the unity of 24 hours, the way the Greeks set it up, the way Joyce set it up, those unities too are far too confining to the way we now conceive of identity and experience. And so I think I constructed it with the idea always that I would move panels around, and I was very committed to taking things often that were quote unquote banal. I did want all these levels. That's how we live. That's how we think. That's how we feel. It's not all great ideas, and it's not all any one thing really. So that was what I kind of hoped to do, and that was the idea of picking up the word tiny, just taking a word and showing, of course, it could have a million meanings. And tiny was something that I think is important in our inflated moment, as Natalie Ginsburg says in I use her quote, she thinks of herself as a small writer. And she said that, it's kind of disturbing if she compares herself to other people that she considers small writers. But if she just thinks of herself as a small writer and considers herself as herself, she feels, that she's more than adequate, however tiny, however much of a flea or a mosquito that I am, I'm okay with it. And I think that sense of proportion, instead of, the power, the pow, we're these voices that are, for me, they become ideological at a certain point because we're too much reflecting messages of this time, and instead words are quieter than that, in my opinion.
Yeah, and thinking too about what you're saying about knowledge and this parallel it's drawn or sort of metaphor between knowledge and silence. You write, someone reading a self-help book, one gets sort of the knowledge they need. I'm sorry, I feel like when I copy pasted this quote from the PDF, it got all messed up. You grow to understand and feel, you write, what they're saying, the comprehension and the questions become the you who engages. You become aware of not knowing. When you listen, this is talking about listening, you face your own ignorance in the noble pursuit of truth. Listening admits that knowledge is real and beyond preconceptions. Knowledge differs fundamentally from self-help. In self-help books, the reader consumes what she is looking for. She never touches knowledge, which requires discovering not knowing and a clear understanding that the text is not about herself. Knowledge belongs to others who have learned from others. To become part of that dialogue, to cultivate, conserve, and delineate what you can possess with hard work, you need to understand listening. And of course, silence. In many respects, you mentioned, John Cage's 433. Silence sort of demands a kind of listening, which brings me to something that runs through the book too, which is the ways we avoid silence. I think this is a particularly American thing too. This goes back to the fragment you read at the beginning, through distraction, and technology kind of appears a lot. There's a fragment where you talk about listening to the sound of the gravitational waves of a black hole on your phone, on a train, and how it seems as though there's this flattening of silences happening on, rather than the depth of experience that may be attending to a kind of silence requires. There's another fragment where you talk about a friend telling you a story about, or sorry, it was, I believe her name was Tatiana. Is that correct? About, yeah, a story you were told of someone setting out walnuts to dry, and they return and they're all gone because the magpies have taken them. And it's a story that can only be told you right through in-person means. Small miseries, injustices, worries often drop into silences unless we tell them face to face. This idea is something that struck me as very new, very familiar generationally with the distraction of social media, the distraction of technology, consumerism it suffuses it all, sort of drive to always be doing something or purchasing something or whatever. But I had never thought about it in this way that you chart in the book, which is that those mediations actually are sort of flattening some kind of experience, whereas there has to be some kind of depth to experience silence or to experience unknowing, or some of these important ideas that are, in many ways, the book is sort of suggesting are revelatory. Perhaps ironically, moments of unknowing become revelations of a kind of knowledge. But I'm just curious, I don't know if you want to expound more on that idea of how it's not the noises that our technology makes, but the presence of it itself, the presence of these sort of layers of mediation do a disservice to attention and take us away from, I don't know, sort of like a three-dimensional experience of the world. Or just, if you have more to say about, it feels like asking a magician to reveal their tricks, or a poet to explain their poem. But I still struck by that black hole fragment and what it suggests about what's lacking in certain experiences. Sorry, because I warned you. It's like, if I become philosophical, I'll go on and I'll lose you.
The black hole one is good, I think, because really there's so many extraordinary things. I try to use silence quite a few times in relation to science, because I mean, our whole life, even this vaccine, how we've managed to come up with it in a couple of years, it's all based on research. It's all been based on completely sorting out a different kind of set of possibilities once we understood the genome and this and that. And we don't really, most of us, if we know the words, we don't really know much more than that. We can even maybe give a few lines of verbal description, but I don't think the actual understanding, and I bring that up many times, the commitment of people to knowledge, which means they devote their lives to a topic, to research, to something, they really have a depth that we can't appreciate. So much stuff has become banalized. And that's why listening to outer space, it was a 20-year project. It was a political project. It took so much government work. It took so much international cooperation. It took so much studying on the part of astrophysicists and this and that. And for us, it's just, oh, hey, we can listen to that, and I don't even know that we know what it is or care that much, but we also access it in a place where other things are going on. And that particular thing, the lady's painting her fingernails, and somebody else is having a coffee, and they don't know I'm a billion miles away, but I don't know what I'm doing a billion miles away, because I don't really understand much of the project. And unless we stop and admit that, and maybe deepen our curiosity in some instances, we're skating on awfully thin ice in terms of what we use in comparison to what we understand.
Thank you. Thank you for finding some place to respond in all of my rambling. I always appreciate when authors are able to find what I'm trying to say somewhere. Yeah, I think that's just an interesting, just something the book opened up for me that I didn't consider, and of course, I think that's the whole thrust of so much of what is so accomplished about this work. I think one of the things I want to make sure for readers who have yet to read the book know as well, which you mentioned too in discussing how the book is structured, is that while there's memoir in the book, there's a very stunning sort of bit of memoir about your father and about this notion of bragging as sort of calling any kind of attention to yourself constitutes bragging. I can certainly see that Midwestern tack there, but the book does attempt to sort of see what it's to place the memoir that is occurring in certain fragments as a function of predecessor narratives. And much of what the book is doing, and I don't want to forget to highlight this, is, I don't want to call it rescuing, pulling up women's voices, women's silences through historical figures, but as well through other authors. You talked about Natalia Ginsburg, the painter Agnes Martin, Charlotte Bronte, Rachel Carson, Hannah Arendt, figures discussed from this mesmerizing plague narrative that occurs in a book that you're translating, and figures with COVID as well. And that's sort of, I just want to sort of mention too that I don't want to forget to describe that the sort of core of this book is yes, placing this memoir amongst all of these other voices as well. And that's a significant part of the silences that are explored, are the silences in your history, in the histories of these other women who are explored or whose stories are sort of retold. And that brings me to, boy, I'm worried about not having another question again about the thing I have a question about. But there's a central story here, a longer period of memoir about your time after you were at Oxford, when you returned to New York and work at the Department of Child Welfare in New York City. You encounter this person named Gwen. You have this sort of profound response to their case. You later leave that job. And it seems to function as, like I said, it's the center of the book, but it also seems to say something about all that's happening in all the other parts of the book when you're exploring, whether it's talking about Natalia Ginsburg or responding to the art of Agnes Martin. And I'm curious to know how you came about to include that powerful. I think it's interesting because it forms sort of, it takes up the way it's positioned in the book compositionally is more sequential fragments than fragments that are sort of explored and then stepped away from for a while and then returned to again. The heron thing, that fragment that you read in the beginning, forms a kind of, I don't give everything away, but it's sort of a book ending segment. But the central segment is quite long. I want to leave the story of Gwen a little bit to readers, although you're welcome to explain it a bit more. But I'm just wondering if that piece sort of always stuck out as kind of something that would form the center of this book, both figuratively and compositionally, and how this idea of returning to these women throughout history came about in addition to this project of writing about silence? That's probably, there it is. I can always find it towards the end.
Yeah, well, we can, let's see. Let's go back to Gwen. I think
Yes.
Gwen, Gwen, of course, is just a deep memory still in terms of in terms of even looking at America today, but of course looking across the world, children, and how institutions don't seem to be able to focus on them deeply, or they focus on them bureaucratically, you know, and yet in the end, it goes back again to the solutions are helped by bureaucracies and, you know, by social workers and by everything else, but there are gaps that can only be filled, I think, by human interaction. The same thing we were talking about when you brought up, you know, the story of the walnut face to face. There's something incredibly compelling about entering into something like somebody's house, their poverty, their social problems, their everything, and not being able in any way to be personal or to respond very personally. And this story always, it's not the only one like that for me, but the fact is that there was no way the institution was going to meet her needs. And it seemed like the only solution could be a personal one. In other words, taking some time, taking some risks, and as I write there, you know, having a complete sense of limits of her privacy and her and the fact that as a social worker, I shouldn't be crossing boundaries, like, you know, trying to teach her to read or telling her how to take a subway or whatever. But there are many times in life when there is no answer except to step in, it seems to me. And it isn't something then afterwards that it remains a silence. There's so much in life of people who do good things, who help others, who, you know, with a kind word, with a long sort of commitment to somebody. There's so many silences in the area of people who respond to others who need things. And it isn't, in the end, it's not an institutional response. It's a personal response. It's a commitment of one's time, of one's knowledge and conscience and feelings. And there's a terrific amount of that in life. Just it's never told, it's never written, it doesn't need to be written probably, but it exists. And it's an interface between need, suffering, lack, and the fact that one either looks for a solution, a personal, minor, small solution, or just doesn't respond at all. And I think Gwen, for me, was that thing. I eventually, as I say, I quit. I'm not prepared professionally to face the kind of things that were needed. I was unhappy with much of the structure, so it didn't seem to me it was very effective. I knew I couldn't create a dependency, because that's the ultimate goal, I think, of caring for people, is to give them independence, to give them a sense of their strength and your admiration for their strength. And I think that's why Gwen was there. She's a silence in herself. She's a silence in the way we focus on children. Every day, there's so many children who need things, and we're a society that doesn't focus much at that level.
Yeah, exactly. I think as well, perhaps for me as a reader, I also saw these connections branching out from Gwen's story to other aspects of the book. Because in recounting this memory, this deep memory, as you call it, you're sort of inscribing this memory. You are, um, you know, you mentioned the literal stories that you felt there's nothing, you can't do anything, you're not adequately prepared to help this person. But now their story, or the idea of this silence that's hidden from us, is unhidden by, even all these years later, writing down her story, and someone like me reading about it and encountering Gwen through text. And that, for me, made this connection to, Cecilia, the lifeless daughter of a peasant in 1630s Italy, in Alessandro Manzoni's The Betrothed. It made connections to the suffering of Agnes Martin, as a person in the world, despite being a now celebrated and revered artist. It made those connections to me. So I saw Gwen's story in the fact that it was centrally located in the text, as kind of pulling together all of these, not disparate, I want to avoid these words that make them seem like everything's just scattered about, but it gave like a center of gravity to those narratives. And so that's why I was curious, just compositionally, if from Gwen's story other ideas branched out, or how it came to be.
Well, I think one, it means that you as a reader allowed yourself to make those connections.
Yeah.
And you made them partly by empathy or feeling. You stopped to just feel those different kinds of being overlooked or suffering or assumption. You focused on children in those different ways. You made the connection in a way, not me.
I see.
And I write in as I sort of tried to bring up and actually admit, some of these more intuitive or dreamlike sort of ways that some connections and things come to me. I suppose by the time I got to Gwen, I too, like you, was responding to making connections partly on the basis of feeling more. Then once you get it out, and once you can move the things around, you can see where it works best, where there's movement. And the fact that it was in the center, I suppose, really, it also spoke to me in these times to the fact that we're again bringing up the whole discourse on racial discrimination and unfairness and poverty, and so she represented so many things, but she did represent the child that was left to basically fend for herself.
I'm glad. I guess I'm glad to hear you say that, in a way that the connections, so much of what you're saying compositionally mirrors what I, in my own minor writing life, I'm also fascinated in doing, and what I respond to, and why I was so, why fireworks went off in my head reading this book, reminded me of other writers I love, whose style you're not, inside of, but whose approach to nonfiction or approach to composition is similar, like Anne Carson or like Sebald, because I feel like that's the most writing can accomplish, is to put these sort of ideas together in order that perhaps in the mind of the reader, through that dialectic, let's say, some kind of truth can be unearthed, right? It's not me proclaiming it in a very sort of analytic way. It's me giving these various figures, and then through the help of your mind, some kind of private truth is unearthed, So I think that's, and then offering the reader the literal space, the physical space on the page to approach those silences is quite marvelous in that sense.
Well, then I have to say we have to give Farrar Straus credit. That's what I asked for, but in a time of cutting, and in a time also of realism, I'm not any kind of best-selling author. They never raised the question at all. They gave me a book which really contains silence in that way. And I talked to somebody who bought it as a whatever you call it, as on Kindle.
Oh wow!
And it doesn't have the same
yeah.
because it is an object. It goes back to another argument through the whole book, which is a book. It's a relationship, and it invites you into silence, and you need to hold it, and you need to return to it. And so at any rate, but they were incredible. I think it's just a beautiful book, and that's their credit.
Well, I mean, that's a great place to get close to concluding on too, is the book as a physical object, which is our whole stock and trade as a store. And I think it's perhaps cliche, but it's true that booksellers are also preternaturally obsessed with books about books and the idea of the book, etc. And you write in Silence and Silences about that physical relationship. Is a quote I have here: turning pages, the inhalation, exhalation becomes a kind of breathing, sometimes a yawn, sometimes panting. Books have a physiological function. They are lungs keeping us alive. So that for a bookseller is just, right dead in the heart for us, what we do. So it's for book as object lovers. It's certainly don't get it on Kindle. Well, I think we're approaching the end of our time. I don't have any questions from our viewers, but if you have any questions for me, you can furiously write them in the next few minutes, and I'll get to them. I'm just curious, maybe as sort of a parting question or penultimate question, maybe. I think I have one more. Obviously, it sounds grateful that FSG gave you the latitude to let this book be what it is. But you mentioned, you had to get rid of some fragments or get rid of some things and moving things around it. And I'm always curious, as someone who got an MFA in poetry and who had a wonderful instructor, the wonderful poet Van Jordan, who was very interested in this idea of poetic composition in terms of how poems are ordered in a book. I'm always curious with books like this that lend themselves to rearranging, what your approach was. I suspect, based on our conversation, that it was perhaps much by feel as anything. But were there fragments that you were sad to part with, but just didn't belong? And beyond that, what was your approach to sort of structuring and restructuring this book in the editing process, given that it lends itself to being rearranged in a certain way?
I think my idea in writing is always, start somewhere and write all the way till you're finished. and then once you're finished, then start reading it, just read it back to front, front to back, and you can begin to see where it's really slow, where you really. But I, somehow living in Parma too, I basically really write alone. I've run around. I did for years and years run writing groups, and I teach writing from time to time. But basically, I'm just on my own. So when I reach the end, I send it to my editor. He used the word hypnotizing. He used the word mesmerizing. He said, just cut it now. I mean, so it was again, I think if you write, and perhaps writing out of America, so I'm not, and really out of it, because, there are many people in Italy who make a big career out of writing in Italy and so on. I'm somehow I'm in a pocket of silence there too. But I think it has deepened me as a writer. It's given me confidence. I can't look around too much. I have to, this questions that we as teachers always say, what am I trying to say? Have I said it? Is it too much? Have I overstated it? Have I understated it? And then the fact is that with computers, the fact is you can print things out, you can move them around. You can I remember my first novel, of course, it was on it wasn't even a Selectric. And then everything you had to type, if you wanted to change anything, you got a scissors, you got some paste, you put it on the paper. And after you've done that a few times, you cease to be critical. You say, well, that's pretty good. That chapter's done. Whereas with computers, you can go in until the last second and be deeply critical, saying that really doesn't work. That isn't enough. That one word isn't right. And you can go back in. And so, sure, I think once you've written a couple of books too, you've written wonderful things that you just give up. And not because you're asked by anybody, but because they don't fit. You get pretty good at knowing that, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Taking notes going forward. I think we've reached the top of the hour and the end of our time. I think I'll just ask one more, hopefully not too annoying book select question, but we're always giving recommendations ourselves, but we always like to hear recommendations from our authors. So if there's anything that you're reading currently that you're enjoying, that you might like to throw a suggestion out to our viewers.
Well, I always enjoy, the poetry. So I'm reading Louise Gluck's last book and reading George Graham's last book. And I wish I had. I just finished a book, a woman's story, Annie Ernaux, who's French, translated from the French. Very nice little book about a mother. Very nice little, really concise and crisp kind of picture of a relationship of a mother and daughter. I wish I had the title, and I don't. I read a book that left such a deep impression on me. It's a book published by a university press. I believe it's Northwestern. It's about the history of the Japanese language and what happened to it that made it possible once the Japanese language, came into its own. How it was possible then to form a national literature, and what the problem is now with English being a language that a lot of countries kind of skip their own language and write into English because it seems it's the only way it'll get out, or it's the only way that book will be noticed. And if there's a way of adding that, I'll look up that. It's a long title and it's kind of specifically, but if it's something that would be useful, I'll send it to you in an email.
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, yeah. You're making me realize too that I didn't even get a chance to ask you about translation, which is a whole nother strata of silence.
Yeah.
But it's, it's a book that the conversations it could create are quite infinite. So, but thank you for that. Yeah, let me know, and I will share those links too to Annie Ernaux's books, etc. If you're watching us on YouTube, you should be able to find those links below in the description. But we've reached the top of the hour. Wallis Wilde-Menozzi, thank you so much for joining us at Home with Literati this evening. I hope we can have you visit Ann Arbor and our store in the not too distant future, but wishing you safe and happy travels back to Parma. And thank you so much for being with us here tonight.
Oh, thanks for this nice conversation.
My pleasure. Bye. Take care, everybody. Have a great night all.
Bye.